Marina Khmelnitskaya. Hän on tutkijatohtori Aleksanterin instituutissa. Tutkii poliittista päätöksentekoa, erityisesti sosiaali- ja asuntopolitiikkaa Venäjällä ja vertailevasta näkökulmasta. Marina, where did you grow up and where did you went to school?
Well, I grew up in Moscow and I went to school also in Moscow, yeah. Normal secondary school.
How was it at the time? When was this about?
Well, it was 1990s. How was it? Well, I finished school. I started it in the late 1980s, finished in the 1990s. How was it? You know, I was thinking of this question. I was trying to sort of remember. You know, I remember growing up. I remember being a teenager with everything what it entails. And for each of us, if we reminisce about this time, it's kind of being rebelling against authorities, whatever authorities are there in your life. Then, you know, experimenting with your hair color constantly or doing other things. So school was, yeah, it was there, but it somehow, yeah, you had your friend circle, so it was just life around it. But then thinking of the school itself, like school per se, actually thinking back, I think I had quite good teachers. Some of them, I was trying to remember the literature teacher, I remember her very well, she was really good. But 1990s, I think it was difficult for them as a sort of as an institution. Obviously, me, I never thought I was kind of into humanities. I loved history or literature, subjects like that. But I wasn't thinking I would be working on social policy as such. So I wasn't thinking in those terms in those days. But I think the lack of funding in those times and it was affecting the teachers as a profession. That's for sure. But still, I think they did really good work, nevertheless.
How did you come up with an idea that you want to study and do research on social policies in Russia? Any politics involved or any, like, how was it?
Yeah, well, I'm trained as a political scientist. That's my discipline. Social policy. I was actually, to start with, quite interested in labor movements, labor unions, and then I realized from my MPhil studies, which was my master's program, that trade unions are quite involved in deciding social policy. They were historically, they were kind of not the main actors, but they always were there. So it somehow moved on from labor unions to policy making, and then since trade unions were quite active in the social policy making, because that's what matters to just wide masses of the public. So it became social policy.
Okay,
yeah.
Markku actually before in the conversation, he mentioned the social policies in Russia and said that we don't really understand in Finland how the social policies are in Russia. Your main focus in your research is social politics and housing policies as well. Can you describe the very basic principle of like post-Soviet era social policy in Russia, the big picture?
Social policy generally, or
yeah.
Housing? Yeah, social policy. Well, it's certainly the Soviet welfare state was based on completely different non-market model. So the entire post-Soviet era was a process of market restructuring with various, not various, but like everything influencing everything. But certainly there was attempts to introduce the market in the provision, but because of people's expectations and because of the bureaucracies which are there, it's not straightforward, and many different interests demand to have their own, provision, whichever relates to them, protected. It's pretty much how it actually develops in other parts of the world. Social policy always generates very dense and very heated politics, particularly when you have to withdraw, politics of retrenchment, And that's pretty much what started in the West in the 1980s. Also because of the various crises, the state had to become less generous. But the question is, where do you cut and how much? And different interests trying to pull the blanket onto themselves. So so social policy generally in Russia is becoming much more neoliberal. And the general policy thrust is in that direction with, for instance, we just observed the increase of retirement age and the kind of heated politics which that generated. So it is the withdrawal of the state from social provision and placing everything on the shoulders of individuals, of families, of households. Yeah.
Okay, thank you Marina. Ja täällä on myös, excuse me my Finnish, Andrey, tutkijat Starodubtsev, something like that, tutkijatohtori Aleksanteri-instituutista, tutkii venäläistä politiikkaa ja pyrkii ymmärtämään, miten venäläinen hallinto toimii. All due respect for your research topic. When we try to talk about Russia, we talk about, like we said in the previous conversation, we talk about many different realities. How big are the differences in terms of political views? Can you give us an idea?
Quite much indeed, because and it concerns social policy and public and governance in Russia indeed, because right now if we look at Russian policy system or Russian governance, we can see that on the one hand, Russia now is a country with great changes in social policy, in public governance, public policy, etc. We have quite many people who are interested in developing contemporary Russian and public governance. We can see significant radical changes in relations between government on the one hand and society on the other hand, because right now Russia is developing mechanisms of e-governance, electronic governance, etc. We can see that in many cities, governors and mayors are developing significant changes in urban policy, in different kind of policies, health policy, education policy. They develop new tendencies. Sometimes we can see that Russia is like Finland, for example, or other European countries. But at the same time, we should admit that the problem is that all success stories are quite individualistic, they're quite specific. And some success stories that we can see in Russia, in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in other big cities, in many small cities, they don't transform the whole system of governance, the whole system of public policy in Russia. And this is the problem for whole Russia, because Russia is bigger than big cities. And yes, realities, political and policy realities in Russia are quite different, and it depends from city, from regions, from ethnic groups, etc.
Marina, about the housing, what is the biggest problem in terms of housing at the moment in Russia?
Well, housing is problem, in every context. You take one country, there will be housing problem. Housing is a peculiar good. The more that you have, the more you want, and the sort of life satisfaction in terms of housing. If you, for instance, add like, I don't know, a few tens of square meters to your dwelling, after about 5 years, you forget about this kind of happy effect of which you had from making your property bigger somehow. So affordable housing is a problem in many contexts. In Russia, it certainly is the case. As I mentioned, the withdrawal of the state and the greater personal responsibility in all of the social spheres, but in the housing sphere as well. That generates, obviously, pressure on personal budgets, on family budgets. Less and less public provision of housing. Russian state became, according to the new housing code, well, they keep calling it new housing code, but it was introduced in 2004. So now it's nearly 15 years old. It limited the state provision of housing to the very poor 5% of the population. All the rest cannot count on any housing provision from the state. So they have to, if they do not have their own, what they call wealth or equity to buy, they have to take out a mortgage. Mortgages have been growing in Russia, the use of mortgage finance, certainly. Compared to other developed and mature mortgage markets, Russian mortgage market is very much in infancy. It's, they measure the weight of mortgage finance, usually the ratio of the mortgage debt to GDP. In Russia, it stands at about 5 or 6%, the mortgage debt to the amount of GDP, which is very small. In some developed countries, it's about 70 or 80%. But people are learning this market mechanisms, and certainly, so affordability of housing is a big issue. That's for sure. And maintenance, because obviously Russia inherited from the Soviet Union this big bulk of industrially built housing estates, and those need to be maintained, repaired. So the question, how do you organize those repairs? Who's supervising them? They're costly. That's an issue. Yeah.
Andrey, now that you look at Russia from Finland, have you noticed anything that you wouldn't have noticed before? Like looking Russia from Finland, does it look different to you than before?
I noticed that Russia and Finland are quite similar from the perspective of governance, from the perspective of public administration. It's very interesting how similar processes of reform, how similar tendencies of changing governmental system are in Russia and Finland. How, indeed, if we look at ideology of policymakers in Russia and Finland, especially in the last 5 years in Finland, it's interesting how similar they are, because neoliberal tendencies that cover a whole world indeed, whole contemporary world indeed, they are very similar in Russia and Finland. It's very interesting.
Can you give us examples? Now that you compare, saying that all the political tendencies are the same.
Yeah, my research focus is education policy, for example, and I studied the reforms of education, of higher education and school education in Russia since 2000. And one day, sometimes I discuss these issues with your experts, and your officials. And for example, in Russia, we can see that educational officials, educational experts try to increase the efficiency of educational system and performance of educational system. And indeed, Finnish experts and Finnish officials say that they try to do the same things and the same measures. But the problem how these things are implemented here in Finland and in Russia, because in Russia the patterns of authoritarian modernization are used, while in Finland is more difficult, of course.
What about Marina? You have lived in Britain as well. Looking at Russia from here or from Great Britain, like the Russian everyday life, have you noticed something that you wouldn't have noticed before, like looking it from abroad?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Speaking as a scientist, speaking as a social scientist, I would like to support what Andrey said just now. When you are studying policy processes, you can't help finding huge similarities and how these processes are similar and how issues are similar and how, well, obviously, global process, well, I spoke just now about mortgage markets. Financial capitalism, it's global, it's got no borders, finance flows, and then this is how markets determine like the interest rates on your mortgage, etc., etc. So certainly from studying policy processes in Russia, it's not like studying policy process on Mars, on the moon. It's still on planet Earth, and there are just different pressures, different interests, and their alignments, their coalitions. That's what determines the policy process. Looking at everyday life, if you ask me, just as a private person, as a citizen, I left Russia in very early 2000s, and people been telling me that like livelihood for people who lived in Russia during the 2000s, it improved a great deal, but I somehow left before it. So yeah, so I probably didn't take as much advantage of that improved living standards. Yeah, it's always your personal perspective and perspective as a scientist. So.
Yeah. What about Andrey, about the everyday life? If you kind of look back and looking from Finland, is anything you wouldn't noticed if you didn't leave Russia? Do you get the idea?
I don't think that there is huge difference between.
Right. Well, actually, okay, thank you. About the Putin, before the next conversation, which is going to be about protest. In your own experience, how popular Putin really is? Martina, how could you tell us?
Yeah. Again, as a scientist, there is research in trying to determine how popular is Russian president really is amongst the people, because the question is, well, perhaps somebody would just be reluctant to say that actually really they do not support him, but still they would say that they do because they're kind of afraid to put their real feelings out. And research shows that even if you control for various emotions like that or considerations like that, people generally still find him as an attractive leader, and he is popular. In everyday life, I do not find people, like at least people whom I know, they do not tend to talk about even the issue. It's not that we would have a tea and would say, do you really support Putin? What do you think of him? No, we would talk about, personal life and, the repairs which we have to do in the house,
sure.
or children, or, yeah. So, but it varies. Some people, they just completely disagree with the course which Russia is taking at the moment, and protesting against even if they may not be taking part in the protest, but they're saying no, this is completely incorrect. Others, they're kind of quiet, so you just have to assume that it's all right. Yeah.
Right. What about Andrey? What do you think? What is the basis of Putin's popularity, if we decide to take it for granted?
It's a very interesting question because Vladimir Putin is a very popular leader, of course, now in Russia, and he is very attractive. His personalistic characteristics, his ideology, his language are very attractive to Russian population. But I think that now the nature of this population, of course, is in the nature of political regime, is in complete political control over mass media, over ideological fields, over political debates, etc., etc. And Vladimir Putin is very popular, but we don't understand, we don't know how long this popularity would be happen if the situation, political situation, would change in Russia.
Okay, thank you, Martina and Andrey. And we'll have the next ones coming up.